Hello, I'm Sally Wiener-Grada, and this is What If, Why Not, How? Where I ask people who have interesting stories and ideas questions that are on my mind. Hello, my guest today is Robert J. Sawyer. Rob is one of only 8 writers, and the only Canadian, to win all 3 of the world's top science fiction awards for Best Novel of the Year. That's the Hugo Award. He won that for Hominids in 2003. The Nebula, and that was 1996 for the Terminal Experiment. And then John W. Campbell Award, Memorial Award, which was for Mindscan in 2006. But that's just the beginning of the list. He also had 12 additional Hugo nominations. His work has been translated into 20 languages, and among the many other awards and accolades, let's see. He won top science fiction awards in France, China, Japan, and Spain, as well as a record-setting 16 Auroras from the Canadian Science Fiction and Fantasy Association. And we're with someone who's rather high up in the British Empire. He's been awarded the Order of Canada, the highest honor bestowed by the Canadian government, the Order of Ontario, the highest honor given by his home province, and I believe you won some kind of medal for Queen Elizabeth's...
Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal, also given to notable people throughout the Commonwealth on the 60th anniversary of Elizabeth's ascension to the throne.
That's really cool. Your novel Flash Forward was an ABC TV series, and you also were one of the script writers on that. And I have to tell you, he's really a great speaker. He's a popular keynoter and TEDx speaker, and he's been interviewed hundreds of times by all media, and now it's my turn. So I'm very thrilled with that. Rob and I met at ICFA this past year. It's the International Conference for Fantastic in the Arts, which is one of my favorite conferences to attend. And over dinner, we had a rather lively conversation, and we touched on the topic of human consciousness, which is of particular interest to both our writing. And I've been looking forward to going into greater depth on the subject with Rob ever since. So here we are now. And welcome, Rob. It's so great to see you.
It's great to see you again, Sally. I really did enjoy that dinner at ICFA, and I'm looking forward, hopefully, to doing it again next year in Orlando, Florida.
Yep, definitely. It's the one I try never to miss. I just read your novel, Quantum Night, which has a lot to do with the nature of human consciousness. And before we start, could you read a bit from it to give the audience a taste of your work and our topic?
Yes. How long do you want me to read for?
Oh, 4 or 5 minutes at the most.
I'm all set. All right, let's do it.
Super.
This happens to be, in fact, the opening of my novel, Quantum Night. Several of my colleagues in the University of Manitoba's psychology department considered teaching to be a nuisance, the ineluctable evil, as Menno Warkentin used to call it, resenting the time it took away from his research. But I loved it. Oh, maybe not as much as I love bananas or binge watching old episodes of Curb Your Enthusiasm or Arrested Development, or photographing globular clusters with my telescope. But as far as things that people would actually pay me to do are concerned, it was right up there. Granted, teaching first-year classes could be overwhelming. Vast halls filled with stagnant air and row after row of angst-soaked teenagers. Mm-hmm. Although my own freshman year had been 2 decades ago, I vividly remembered signing up to take introductory psych in hopes of making sense of the bewildering melange of anxiety and longing that swirled then, pretty much now, too, within me. Cogito ergo sum? More like solicito ergo sum. I fret, therefore I am. But on this gray morning, I was teaching the neuroscience of morality, a third-year class with fewer students than February had days, and that allowed for not just lecturing, but dialogue. Last session, we'd had a spirited discussion about Watson and Skinner, focusing on their notion that humans were nothing more than stimulus response machines whose black box brains simply spit out predictable reactions to inputs. But today, instead of continuing to demolish behaviorism, I felt compelled to take a dark detour, using the ceiling-mounted projector to show the Savannah prison photos WikiLeaks had made public over the weekend. Some were individual frames from security camera video the guards caught unawares from on high. Although what was depicted was brutal, they weren't the most disturbing images. No, the really disquieting ones, the ones that knotted your stomach, that made you avert your eyes, that you just couldn't effing believe, were the posed photos. The picture of the officer with her boot on a prisoner's back while she gave a jaunty thumbs up to whatever a-hole was holding the iPhone. The still of the two uniformed men tossing a naked, emaciated prisoner so hard against the ceiling that his skull, as x-rays would later show, had fractured in 3 places. The snapshot of the mustachioed sergeant straddling a downed man while defecating on his chest, one hand clamped over the inmate's mouth, the other flashing a peace sign, the image then having been run through an Instagram filter to make it look like an old-fashioned Polaroid. White frame and all. My stomach roiled as I stepped through the slides, one atrocity giving way to the next. It was now 16 years after Abu Ghraib, for God's sake, a half century since Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment. Not only were guards supposed to be trained about situational pressures and how to avoid succumbing to them, but 2 of those shown in the videos were studying to be wardens. They knew about Zimbardo. They were aware of Stanley Milgram's shock machine obedience to authority experiments. They'd read the summaries of the Takuba report on the Abu Ghraib atrocities. And yet, despite being specifically taught to recognize and avoid the pitfalls, a word that at first seemed innocuous, but if one reflected upon it, suggested tumbling into the abyss, following Lucifer into the very fires of hell, each of these men and women had dehumanized the perceived enemy and, in the process, had lost their own humanity. All right, I said to the shocked faces of my students, what can we take from here? Anyone? The first hand that went up belonged to Ashton, who still had acne and hadn't yet learned that it was permissible to trim a beard. I pointed at him. Yes? He spread his arms as if the truth were self-evident. Simple, he said, and he flicked his head toward the screen behind me, which I'd left on the last slide, the one showing a gangly guard named Devin Becker killing a naked prisoner by holding his head underwater in a jail cell sink. You can't change human nature. That's a little taste of my novel, Quantum Night.
And it is a shocking opening, that's for sure. Thank you so much, Rob.
You're welcome.
It was quite a read, and I highly recommend it to anybody. Well, any of your books I highly recommend. What was the inspiration behind Quantum Night?
There were a bunch of inspirations, but the first one was that up until that point, I had been very well known for being an optimistic science fiction writer. And although I pay very little attention to reviews, I never read my Amazon or Goodread reviews, but I do read the ones in newspapers and journals and magazines. And some had said, that Sawyer guy, I mean, he's great, he writes well, all of that, but he's almost Pollyanna-ish in his optimism about humanity. He's never really grappled with evil. And I had not grappled with evil because I'm a science fiction writer, and I think of evil as opposed to good being a fantasy construct. In fantasy worlds, there's pure evil and there's pure good. Not only that, in things like Star Wars, which is fantasy, not science fiction, they know which is which. They know whether they're following the bright side or the dark side of the Force. So I thought, okay, maybe there is some science of evil. Well, what do we do in the present day when we want to find something out? Boom, 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 into Google, science of evil. And what comes up immediately? But psychopathy, the science of psychopaths, the science of people who, for whatever reason, and there are various theories, and I certainly extrapolate one into my novel, have no conscience. They have consciousness. That is, they are aware, and that cogito ergo sum that I referred to, Descartes' famous statement, well, if I can ask myself whether I'm thinking, there must be an asker. Therefore, I must exist. That's all the cogito means.
Mm-hmm.
And they have consciousness for sure. They are aware that they exist. But conscience is another layer on top of consciousness. Conscience is that inner voice that says, yeah, you could do this, Rob, but should you do this, Rob? Or, man, Rob, you shouldn't have done that. Now I'm going to make you feel guilty over it. That's conscience. Psychopaths are devoid of it, and they're devoid of empathy, which is the ability not just to see that somebody else is in distress or happy or whatever emotion they might be feeling, but to take part of that onto yourself, to literally feel it yourself as well, to empathize, not just sympathize. Oh, I feel sorry for you. You lost your job. I empathize. I know I feel the same way. That's the difference. So given that brief from the reviewers who were saying, okay, Sawyer, let's hear your take on evil, I decided to write a novel about evil, and Quantum Night became that book.
Interesting. Well, I have so many things that came out of your response that I want to ask you about, but I'd like to define a couple of terms from that, because the definition of human consciousness is something of a slippery subject, depending upon the frame of reference and your field of study.
And who you ask and what point you're trying to make.
Yeah. So what is your working definition, or one of your working definitions, when you're writing about it?
So the most famous definition for what we would call the high-level consciousness that you and I enjoy is passing the mirror test. It's such a simple test where if you don't do it with adults because they already know what a mirror is, do it with a baby, or an adult chimpanzee, do it with a dolphin, do it with an elephant, do it with a horse, do it with any number, parrots. And what you do is you put a mirror in front of them. But before you put the mirror there, and when the parrot or the dolphin or you or the child were sleeping, you've dabbed a little dirt or a spot of color onto their forehead or above their beak or somewhere prominent. You put the mirror in front of them. Now, they know something's amiss with the face. If they reach towards the mirror and try to rub it off the other animal, they haven't got a sense of an inner existence of their own. But if they see it and they go, oh, and they rub their own forehead, is there something wrong with me? Then they do. And in terms of empirical tests we can actually do, it's become kind of the common benchmark to say, yes, human beings, almost all, unless they have mass cognitive deficiencies, adult human beings, not children. There's a point in childhood development where they switch over to not recognizing themselves in the mirror, to recognizing themselves in the mirror. And nobody teaches them what a reflection is. This is something that innately an animal or a human being grasps. And of course, there are reflections in nature in a still pond of water or whatever shiny object you might find. There are reflections. So it's not like a mirror is entirely outside the realm of natural experience. But that's a good benchmark right there. If you can tell that something that a representation is of you and it impels you to do something about that representation, then you could be said to be conscious.
That's a wonderful definition of it, and I know that's very much used as a benchmark. But you are so much a science explainer, extrapolator. You do it so beautifully. Sometimes I'm not sure what's the truth or what's your imagination, but that's a whole nother story. We'll go into that in a few minutes. So, but consciousness is something that's going on in here. Something happening.
It's going on in here, although I just want to pause for a second, or maybe also in the spinal cord.
Yes.
Maybe also down to the tips of your fingers, right? We had this until quite recently, the Futurama version where you would just save the head in a jar and have the whole person in the future. We've seen more and more evidence that all sorts of parts of the psychological structure of a person. Obviously, if you lose a finger, you don't lose any of your memories. And people who are paraplegic or quadriplegic still are functionally, obviously, very sophisticatedly conscious. But nonetheless, yes, there's somewhere in this physical container, in my case, 78 kilograms of human being, that contains the consciousness that is Rob Sawyer.
Yeah, and there's a lot of work on trying to understand this concept, and you use a lot of that science and extrapolate from it. What is your current working perception
Paradigm or
or
hypothesis. Yeah.
yeah. What is
Yeah,
your
the paradigm I most approach is, I'll preface it by saying this. The job of a science fiction writer is not to choose the most likely explanation of a scientific phenomenon. It's to choose the most entertaining or interesting or intriguing one that we can't easily gainsay by what we actually know. So there absolutely is one theory of consciousness that is contentious, but very much in the literature. And that is the one that was put forward by now, he wasn't at the time, but now, speaking of honors within the empire, Sir Roger Penrose, OBE, a physicist in England, who way back in the 90s said, I've tried to make sense of it. I'm a mathematician. I understand how computers work. Everybody says, and it's always in vogue at every point in human history to say, well, whatever part of the body you point to operates like whatever the most advanced technology is of the day. So they say, the brain is obviously a computer. I know how computers work. The brain does not function the way a computer does, not even remotely like a computer. And he came to the conclusion that consciousness, in fact, was not computable in a traditional way, and it required a quantum mechanical component. And he had this idea, and he based it on, there's this thing called Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which suggests that there are certain postulates within a given system that can't be proven within that system, and yet are absolutely true. And he said that's a much closer analog to consciousness than anything that an analog or digital computer does. So where do we get the realm of things that can be in multiple states where they can be either or simultaneously? That's quantum physics. So okay, consciousness, I think, I being Penrose, thinks it must be quantum mechanical. He had no idea how, right? And then he was contacted by a man who later became my friend. I've met Sir Roger subsequently, and Stuart is an actual friend. Stuart Hameroff, who is an anesthesiologist. Now, what is an anesthesiologist? That's somebody who is professionally trained to turn off consciousness reliably, and even more so to make sure it turns back on, because he'll be sued into the very fires of hell, as I alluded to in my opening reading, if he fails to do that, right? So he had to have a grasp of consciousness in a very physical way. And he got very, very curious. He knew what chemicals and what processes, could induce unconsciousness. Why? He got fascinated. And he came to study and came to the conclusion that the action of anesthetics on a very microscopic part of your neural tissue has what's called a cytoskeleton. A cytoskeleton is an internal skeleton. If you didn't have cytoskeletons in your cells, they're blobs of jelly. They just go flat. They have cellular scaffolding to give them the globular, spherical, whatever shape they need. In neuronal tissue, the tissue that makes up the neurons of your brain, the cytoskeletons are made up of a certain kind of thing. It's called a tubulin dimer that has what appears to be a warm body temperature, quantum mechanical effect going on in them all the time. It's very unusual, very hard to get quantum effects at room temperature or body temperature, 37 degrees Celsius, 98 degrees Fahrenheit. Very hard to keep them stable from decohering. But they do happen in nature. There's a quantum mechanical component to how birds use magnetic particles to navigate, for instance. It does happen. There are quantum mechanical processes shown in the natural world. So these are going on in our brain. So he contacted Penrose and said, I think I know where that quantum mechanical part of consciousness is. It's in the tubulin dimers, in the microtubulin components that make up the cytoskeletal structure of the neuronal tissue of the brain, going down to a sub microscopic level. And they have collaborated ever since, decades now, on finding more and more experimental proof and more sound theoretical underpinnings for this model. And it is just so ripe with possibilities. The notion that human consciousness isn't just something that you can duplicate on a computer, but requires the the almost magical, spooky action at a distance, as Einstein called it, of quantum mechanics. And so I riff on that endlessly in my books. In my most recent, The Downloaded, and in Quantum Night, in my previous book, Mind Scan, in Golden Fleece, my first novel, over and over again, I go back to the Penrose-Hameroff model of quantum consciousness, which has a technical name, OR, Orchestrated Objective Reduction, but just the Penrose-Hameroff model is what it's usually called.
Marvelous explanation. Now, microtubulars, correct me if I'm wrong, but they're involved in mitosis, in the dividing.
Absolutely, that's right. They're not unique to neurons. That's right.
And they're, so we're dealing with them in chromosomes and DNA.
Yes,
correct.
That's right. They're what's used to help pull apart in meiosis to split. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So is there any part of consciousness that is either proposed or you extrapolate being passed down through DNA?
So that's a very interesting concept. And I do play with that, not in this novel, Quantum Night. I play in that to some degree in my novel Frame Shift. Frame shift is a term from genetics and refers to when a copying error, everybody knows the genetic code, the 4 letters.
Yes.
And they pair up with the opposite letters on the opposite side. And reproduction is you have one string and it pairs up with the other. Every once in a while, a piece falls out and you get a shift in the frame, causes a mutation. And I actually postulated in that novel that not only the past of humanity, but the future of humanity is coded in a series of frame shift jumps that are essentially, by whatever forces of either nature or the cosmos, are initiated at appropriate points in the development of our species.
And that's your mind scan.
That's Frame Shift. Frame Shift. One of those
Frame Shift.
Hugo Award nominated novels that you mentioned.
Yes.
Won Japan's top science fiction award. Frame Shift, all one word.
I have to read that because it's a concept I'm going to play with if I ever finish the current novel. That's
right.
I'm playing with. That's the next research I'm doing.
Absolutely.
Now, you've written, as you mentioned, a lot about consciousness and quantum, the relationship to quantum mechanics or physics, whatever you want to call it, including in your newest Downloaded. Which, as I haven't read it yet, I'm looking forward to it. It's about humans having their consciousness uploaded to a quantum computer. So it seems to be a natural progression for you to go into that direction. It sounds like
yes,
fun.
Absolutely.
Now, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, so the central conceit of the Downloaded is this. When I was doing a minor in psychology in the late 70s, early 80s, it was considered verboten to think of brain and body as separate substances. Dualism, which was a Cartesian, that is related to René Descartes, concept that the mind and body are separate things, was being expunged from our intellectual landscape for the simple expedient, as Descartes had gone looking, okay, if they're two separate things, they obviously interface somewhere. If they don't interface somewhere, your mind could not tell your legs to walk. You could not taste the food they have to interface. He went looking for where the interface was. And if, back in the day, obviously we had only gross anatomy of brains. And he saw, you got this left lobe and this right lobe and everything is paired, except way down in the middle, there's the pineal gland. And it's in the middle and it's not paired. Right. So he said, that's the interface. That's the mediating. Well, the thing is, you can people get cancer of the pineal gland and other things go wrong, and it gets removed surgically or shorted out electrically or whatever, and people still don't lose consciousness. So obviously he was wrong, but because he had failed to find it, and anybody else had able to find the interface, it became de rigueur to say they can't be separate substances, or one could not affect the other. But as we've moved forward into the 21st century in neuroscience, in physics, and in philosophy, dualism has made a resurgence. Now, why is that relevant to my novel, The Downloaded? Well, the conceit in The Downloaded is one that a real existing piece of technology, in a sense, that's been marketed for years now. Alcor, ALCOR, is the biggest seller of this product. which is the cryogenic freezing of dead bodies in the hopes that someday medical science will advance to the point where whatever killed you, was it cancer, was it a stroke, was it whatever, a bullet to the head that we can't repair now, but maybe nanotechnologically can be repaired. Who knows? They're saying someday in the future, if they can be repaired or cured, then we can thaw you out and you'll come back to life. That's a monist, not dualistic approach. It says the brain, if the heart starts up, the liver starts up, the lung starts up, the brain starts up, and they all do the thing they were supposed to do. But if, in fact, our consciousness is dualistic, if consciousness is separate from our physicality, then just because the brain starts doing things again doesn't mean that the consciousness will appear. And we certainly know that a brain can function without any consciousness. We have brain dead people who are on life support, right? Who are the body, who still, the medulla oblongata is doing what it has to do and all that. So I said, no, Alcor's got it wrong. You can't just freeze the body, because consciousness, the one thing we know about consciousness is it's continuous in a sense from the moment we're born to the moment we die, except in those cases of deep anesthesia. And one could argue even then there's a degree of consciousness. But when the consciousness finally disappears, it doesn't go away when you're sleeping. That's you can't have dreams that you could possibly recall if you had no consciousness. So when consciousness stops, I posit that's it. It has to be continuous. And so you can't just freeze the body. You have to scan the brain, because the consciousness is quantum mechanical. You have to scan it into a quantum computer and keep the consciousness running. For all that time you're waiting for medical science to catch up and cure the body, you can't let the consciousness stop. You can't freeze it, because if you do, that's the very definition of death. Consciousness is ended. So that's the conceit in that book. It's based on a dualistic approach, and that and the Penrose-Hameroff model, and the notion that you store the body cryogenically frozen a little bit above absolute zero, but separately you store the consciousness, and it still has to run in a virtual environment for the eventual downloading of the title of my book, The Downloaded, when it comes time to refuse the two components, to go back to what looks at the gross surface level, to not any longer be dualistic, but to be monistic.
Marvelous concept. Now, you are spouting so much science, so much knowledge in this field that you've immersed yourself in. We both know that research can become a rabbit hole for authors, taking over a writer's life. And to a certain extent, I have a feeling it has taken over your life. I'd love to know a little bit about your process of, do you compartmentalize? How do you handle that you are writing and researching and writing and researching? What is your process on that?
So you're absolutely right. I am a good writer, but I love doing research. And if one could contrive one's life in the exact way one wanted it to be, I would simply be paid oodles of money to follow my nose, researching whatever happened to intrigue me. Unfortunately, no benefactor has shown, and I know a couple of billionaires, and they haven't coughed up yet. None of them have said, okay,
well, we should play this for them. We should play this. We'll play this for them.
We'll play this video. Jeff Bezos, Mike Lazaridis, listen up.
Yeah.
Right? Nobody has offered to let me do that. So I have to monetize my research obsession. So every once in a while, I have to sit down and write a book. And into that book comes everything that's fascinated me for the last several years. When I first started writing my novels, for my first 2 decades, I'm a novelist for 34 years now, I was a reliable novel a year person. And that meant that I could only spend 3 or 4 months doing research before I had to spend 2 or 3 months doing the first draft, and then 2 or 3 months doing revisions. And then there's the end of the year where it's promoting the previous year's book and blah, blah, blah. There goes the year. And I decided I didn't like that. In fact, Quantum Night was the book where I decided I didn't like that. And I said to my editors, I'm not going to meet my deadline. And I actually had a good reason. My younger brother was passing away, and he did. In fact, as we talk now, this past weekend was the 11th anniversary of him dying from lung cancer at 51. But when he was dying, I can't, there's no way I'm going to meet this deadline. And my editors in Canada, Adrienne Kerr in New York, Ginger Buchanan, wonderful women, both of them said, Rob, you always meet your deadlines. You're not one of these writers who's constantly, of course, you say you need more time, you take it, you deal with family, you whenever the book is ready, the book will be ready. Well, that was so liberating. I mean, I mourn the death of my brother, but this is a gift he gave to me. Mm-hmm. The last gift he gave to me was my realization that I didn't have to write a book a year. I was economically prosperous enough through all my work and the TV series that I had at Flash Forward and so forth. I didn't have to maintain that schedule. And it was artificial. I was doing it because, I just always been doing it that way. When that was taken away, I started taking much longer to do research. And for the book between the Quantum Night and the Download is my book, The Oppenheimer Alternative, for instance. And I said, for that one, I'm going to take an entire calendar year and do nothing but research on the Manhattan Project, on the characters involved on the Manhattan Project, on the peace movement that came out, of course, of the tragedy of the nuclear holocaust at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, of Oppenheimer's change of heart, of all those great characters, Feynman, Hans Bethe, Einstein, Leo Szilard, Teller, Feynman, who are in that story. And that was one of the best years of my life, just a whole year of doing no research. And then eventually I sat down and I wrote the book. So for me, it's a question of I'm constantly researching. Now, it's dangerous when you're trying to draft. And my favorite key on my keyboard is the X, because when I reach a point where I don't know something, I'll type 5 X's and go on with the writing. Because if I stop at that moment to check online, I'm gone for 3 hours following links, hyperlinks, going down the rabbit hole that is Wikipedia and following up on this. So I do all of that at, I get my words for the day. I try to get 2,000 words a day, manuscript, and then go and fill in the little facts that need filling in. The big facts, I already know. I've already done the months or years of research that go into one of my books before I start writing the first word.
I like asterisks rather than the X. I use it.
The X is terrific. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, but the asterisks, I don't have asterisks.
Asterisk, you have to shift for. It's a shift.
That's true.
I'm a lazy man. There's no shift for an X. I mean, you can shift and get a capital X, but then you're talking Roman numerals, right? If you get a capital.
Right. The New York Times has described you as, quote, a writer of boundless confidence, as we're hearing that now, and bold scientific extrapolation.
Yes, indeed. And in fact, it was Frame Shift, the book we alluded to earlier, that prompted that comment.
I'm fascinated about how you, in reading The Quantum Night, I hadn't read anything of yours for a little while, I apologize. So it was a great reintroduction to your work. You seamlessly extrapolated theories of quantum mechanics and psychopathology, the psychology of psychopaths, as well as experiments involving the human brain and crowd psychology and other disciplines, with some current events, political science and social activism thrown in. You had me Googling constantly all kinds of names and terms and citations, because I wasn't sure where the facts were and where your imagination was. For instance, I had never heard of PZs, philosophical zombies. I was sure.
I did not make them up. David Chalmers, Australian philosopher of the mind, who is now at New York University. Of course, he called them, as we call them here in Canada, PZs. You might PZ. See, PZ sounds like easy peasy. So right. PZ. But yeah, philosophical or philosopher zombies. In fact, that was the title I submitted the novel to my publisher, Ace Science Fiction, as The Philosopher Zombie. And the sales force was afraid that people would think it was a tie-in to The Walking Dead, which was so popular at the time. And it was absolutely the right title for my novel, Quantum Night. Quantum Night was, of all my 25 novels now, Quantum Night is my least favorite title. It was a compromise foisted upon me between debates with the sales force at Penguin Random House USA and me, and we had a contest on my Facebook wall and voting for different possible titles, and we ended up with one that is like, as people say about democracy, it's not great. Or capitalism, or whatever one you want to fill the blanket, but it's one we can all live with. It's not perfect, but it's one we can all live with, right? Philosophical zombies. Well, first I'll say two things. Quantum Night has a further reading section at the back of the novel, as do a bunch of my books. Oppenheimer Alternative is a very extensive one, and so forth. And I provide my references, in other words, but not in the body of the text.
Yeah.
Sally, you frozen in video. Are you still alive?
I'm alive.
Okay, but if you were a consciousness, you'd be dead now, because the video I'm seeing of you has just frozen, locked solid. In a attractive still frame, but you don't have like one eye open like Bill the Cat. There you go. You're moving again.
You weren't frozen, so we're okay.
All right.
We didn't lose.
So, but here's the rule of thumb for a Robert J. Sawyer novel. I can't vouch for the rest of my colleagues. If I say something is a scientific fact in my novel, and that novel is set, let's say, in a given year, for instance, Quantum Night is actually set in 2016. If I say it's an established scientific fact, and I cite any scientist, doesn't matter, it's real. If one of my characters discovers it, or if the novel is set in the future, say my novel Flash Forward was, one of the character, if it's cited as being discovered after the date of publication, right? Flash Forward came out in 1999, but I say, and in 2004 they found, well, obviously that's my extrapolation.
Yeah.
So if it's established fact at the date at which the novel was published, then that's true. And if it's something that I cite a scientist having found, give the name, like David Chalmers, for instance, it's true. If one of my characters discovers it, it is plausible extrapolation of what we already know into what might realistically be, which is the requirement of writing scientific invention in science fiction, in hard science fiction, which means rigorously extrapolated science fiction that pays real attention to known science.
Right.
Hard science fiction.
Yeah. No, the extrapolation you do is just, it just rings so true. It really does.
Thank you.
And I would love to do tap you for a little bit of that now.
Sure.
Just to see what we come up with. It's probably something you've already done, so you'll tap into what you've already thought of. But as I mentioned, my next novel I'm going to be doing, I never pronounced this right, Panpsychism. Is that the right pronunciation? In which the belief that everything in the material world...
Panpsychism. Yeah. Because it's from psychic, so it's
panpsychism.
Psychic, pan everywhere.
Okay.
The mind is everywhere. Panpsychism.
Thank you. I only ever read it. I don't say it aloud. I read it or I write it.
Panpsychism. Panpsychism.
Okay. Panpsychism. And it's the belief that everything in the world, no matter how small, has some consciousness, which is a fun concept that, to a certain extent, we alluded to earlier.
Including not just living things, but rocks, everything, stars, everything, yes.
And it also has consciousness, human quantum entanglement, and DNA. And you said that you had some ideas about this, and we didn't have time to go into it because we already had our dessert. And the waitress was getting tired. We'd been talking for a long time. We have time now. So I'd love to hear an extrapolation from whatever time in the future you pick, 2050, 2030, whatever you want. I'd be curious where you would take that.
So, okay, there's no empirical evidence for panpsychism. No. Nobody has ever managed to do a Vulcan mind meld with a rock and get a thought out of it. Spock managed it with the Horta. We haven't. We put them in our, electroencephalographs. It's a rock. Nothing's happening. So why do we even have a valid scientific reason for believing that consciousness must be everywhere? And that comes to quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics says that everything that could happen, it's like the movie that won the Academy Award 2 years ago, Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. Everything that could happen is simultaneously happening in a chaotic, indeterminate state. Mm-hmm. And only when a qualified observer looks does it collapse into a concrete reality. And we can demonstrate this. The famous experiment, your viewers can look it up, is the two-slit or twin-slit experiment that shows absolutely clearly that light behaves as particles when a scientist is looking at it and as waves when a scientist is not looking at it. And why the fact that the scientist is looking at it should make the slightest difference to photons is one of the great conundrums of modern science. But the implication is this, that it collapses into a concrete reality when the scientist looks at it. Well, we've been around as Homo sapiens for 200,000 years, as genus Homo for 1 million, maybe 2 million years, when we split from the chimps 7 million years ago. At some point, you go back far enough in our lineage and we fail the mirror test. There's no consciousness there. You go back, even as everybody watches The Big Bang Theory knows, our universe is almost 14 billion years old. 13.8 to be precise. It's in the theme song, Canadian group, the Bare Naked Ladies singing it. You know it must be true. But Earth is only 4.5 billion years old. Right. So even if its life has consciousness, and the first protist, which appeared maybe 3.8 billion years ago, the first very simplest life forms that appeared had consciousness, there's still all this time, the bulk, in fact, of the existence of the universe, in which certainly on Earth, there were no conscious observers whatsoever. And even in the early days of the universe, the only two elements that were created in the Big Bang is an enormous amount of hydrogen and a tiny amount of helium. And everything else, including most of the helium and all the other elements that populate the periodic table, were created in subsequent generations of stars. So the first generation of stars was, in fact, as chemically simple as anything could possibly be. Hydrogen is by far is the simplest atom. It doesn't have a neutron. It's one proton, one electron. It's the simplest atom. And is there consciousness in a star made out of hydrogen? Well, no, we wouldn't think so. But if there isn't, then what caused any of that primordial expulsion from the Big Bang to collapse into any form of concrete reality? There had to be, if you take that theory seriously, qualified observers independent of biology. There had to be within, innate to the universe, its own consciousness. So that's the quantum physics argument in favor of panpsychism. And the people who embrace panpsychism range from, tree huggers who want to believe that the tree has feelings to, all sorts of flaky sorts. But when you look at it,
it also has
a belief in it, a rational belief in it, quantum physics to the rescue. Sorry, go ahead.
It also has some very strong religious implications.
Oh, absolutely. That's
because intelligent design is based on this whole, or not based on what you've said, but it's based on the whole idea that there was some intelligence behind all that designed it all to happen. And
that's right. Now, the problem, absolutely. And of course, that intelligence design, we would, in common parlance, call God.
Right.
And the problem is we come back to Descartes' issue. If God is external to the universe, somewhere there has to be the interface with the universe. There has to be the pineal gland of God that allows him to have agency in the world. Now, of course, in Christian mythology, that agency occurs when Christ becomes God incarnate. But prior to that, there was still God the Father and the Holy Ghost, the Holy Spirit, separate of the Trinity.
Right.
Although, if you read enough Christian theological apologetics and so forth, they will say that Christ was present and the Trinity existed from the dawn of time. It's all very complex and doesn't actually make a lot of sense to me, but absolutely. So God either is external to the universe or is immanent within the universe.
Right.
If he's immanent within the universe, then he is that prime observer at the beginning. But then you wonder why, if he's creating things as he goes along, why quantum mechanics exists at all. He doesn't need the superposition of all these God's second thoughts, third thoughts, fourth thoughts, all these different possibilities. God didn't say, let there be light and let there be some other kind of mediating subatomic particle that moves something else and sometimes behaves. Well, light will have it behave like a wave and like a particle, and this other one I'll have behave like a bullfrog and like the vibrating string on a violin. And no, I'm not going to use that one. I'm going to use light instead, and it collapses and the universe is filled with light. Right? We don't have a sense that God had all these quantum superposition of alternate possibilities. He was a designer, an intelligent design, who knew and created de novo these things, and then, as in the Judeo-Christian tradition of Genesis, left it up to Adam to name all these things that God had created. In other words, God was maybe a good engineer, but he wasn't a marketing guy. He didn't come up with his name. It was up to Adam to get in there and say, bullfrog, reindeer, monarch butterfly. And God's going, this is brilliant, Adam. All right, man. All right. But you're gone. You're over. You ate the apple. I'm sorry.
That's marvelous. Thank you for that riff. That was fun. Are you willing to share what you're working on now? A little bit
I'm
about
right
it.
at that quantum mechanical crossroads we're talking about, because I was working on a novel called Domestic Us about the potential for artificial intelligence and human beings to find a modus vivendi, a way to live together in peace and harmony, which we desperately are going to need and doesn't seem likely to occur unless an awful lot of forethought is given to it. And then the Downloaded came out 6-7 months ago now.
Yeah.
Originally as a Audible. Audible had a 6-month exclusive for their audio production of it, and then it came out a month ago in print, an ebook. And the response to the Audible original was huge.
Wow.
Partly, I like to think, and in my private moments, but mostly because I wrote it so well, but without question because Brendan Fraser, the Academy Award-winning actor who had just won the Best Actor Oscar the year before for The Whale, is the lead performer / narrator in the Downloaded. Anyways, so Audible asked me to outline a sequel to the Downloaded. And I did one, and taking another term from philosophy, I called the sequel, the Downloaded, to Ghosts in the Machine, after the notion in philosophy that the ghost is this dualistic thing in the machine of the body that gives us animated life.
Right.
And today, and we had a back and forth about that. And I today, this morning, the day we're having this conversation, submitted basically my final version of what I think the sequel should be. And they will either say yes, in which case that will be my next project, or they will say no, in which case it's back to writing the other project, which, as I said, is called Domestic Us. So I'm in quantum flux in 2 days. In fact, in just about exactly 48 hours as we're recording this, I have my conference call with Audible, and we will find out which quantum fuzziness will decohere into a concrete reality that will be Robert J. Sawyer's 26th novel.
Marvelous. It sounds great. I hope that if they say nay to it someday, you will do it, because it sounds
I might
like
write
a
it
good one.
anyways, because
Yeah.
it's so bloody good. I got to say, I'm really pleased with what I came up with. Because I
liked it.
wrote, as I almost always write, Quantum Night and Frame Shift, the other books we've alluded to, Flash Forward, no intention for a sequel. Never intended. They have complete beginnings, middles, and ends. They say what I wanted to say thematically on the topic in question. And so to have them come back and say, oh, please, sir, we want some more, means that I have to come up with something that I'd never planted the seeds for, but deal with every little thing I'd already established. I'm not a writer who will, they call it in film and television making, retcon it. Retroactive continuity. You go back and change the origin story for Spider-Man, or what happened to Captain Kirk when he was young, or whatever, because what you'd established before is interfering with the story you want today to tell today. I refuse to retcon. And for the Downloaded, that set huge challenges for the sequel. But I'm quite pleased with the solutions I came up with, which involve quantum mechanics and uploaded consciousness and quantum entanglement, not only across space, but across time.
Marvelous. I've, I have so many books on my to-be-read list, but these are definitely getting up on the high part. You're clearly one of the more successful and respected writers, and certainly deserve it. You've produced a significant volume of work. Do you have a guiding principle or suggestion for aspiring writers who want to know how you do it?
Sure. Write the stories you want to read. Don't write for market. Never ask yourself what's hot right now, especially if you're pursuing traditional publishing. You say, what's hot right now? And I'll say what we call, as a subset of science fiction, cli-fi, which is climate change-oriented futuristic fiction.
Right.
The hottest thing, quite literally, right now.
Yeah.
But by the time you sell your book to a traditional publisher, it's going to be 3 years down the road. And that will still be dealing with the hellscape of a climate that we've created for ourselves. But that particular vein will not be rich to mine anymore. So you can't write to market.
No.
Don't. And don't write stories in somebody else's universe. You can do that and think that you're going to accrue your own fans. You write Star Trek, Star Wars, Buffy, you name it. Those fans are fans of Star Trek, Star Wars, and Buffy. And they're not going to, in any appreciable number, become your fans. So it's a waste of time. Yes, you may have fun playing in the playground that you really enjoyed as a child, but you're a grown-up now. It's time to step out of that playground and invent your own worlds. Write something that you passionately care about. Don't write what you know, right? This comes back to our research theme, what you can find out about. But also, don't just write what you can find out about. Write what you want other people to know. You have a platform as a writer. And what you write, it can be, if you want, and it's all your ambition rises to, just pure escapist entertainment. But the writers that endure, not just from year to year, but decade to decade, and indeed century to century, are the writers who have something thematically that they want to say, a message. Message is not a dirty word in fiction. Message is the whole point. Now, on the nose and preaching, that's inelegant. But when people stop and reflect with that consciousness, and that conscience, that inner life, on what it is that they've read, they should say, oh, I never thought about that in that particular way before. That was a profound book. Write that, and you'll have a great career.
Marvelous, marvelous advice. Thank you so much, Rob.
My pleasure.
My guest today was Robert J. Sawyer, one of our generation's most lauded science fiction authors, and rightfully so. His newest book, which came out this past April, is The Downloaded. As he said, it's about humans who have their minds uploaded into a quantum computer. I'm definitely looking forward to reading that one. In fact, I highly recommend buying and reading any of his books. And as you saw for the past few minutes, if any time you have an opportunity to hear him speak, get a front row seat. It's just going to be fun. You can connect with Rob on his 1 million-plus word website. You have more than 1 million words on the website.
Yeah, 800 different documents, over 1 million words. I'm a huge physical media fan in movies and television, DVD, Blu-ray, because I like the special features, all the behind-the-scenes stuff.
Yeah.
You'll find a lot of that for all of my novels, the short stories, and all sorts of other things on my website.
Fabulous.
sfwriter.com. S is in science, F is in fiction, writer.com.
You got that one early.
I did. I was the first science fiction writer in the world to have a website.
Oh, my.
And, I thought, this World Wide Web thing might catch on. And you got to be in on the ground floor to get a URL like that. The one I should have registered was science fiction, not science fiction, sci-fi, sci-fi.com. Because my friend, Martin Harry Greenberg, registered that and then turned around a decade later and sold it to the Sci-Fi Channel for $1 million. He sold that, making it the highest paid science fiction writer in history. $500,000 for sci and $500,000 for fi. So
that's marvelous. Well, if you go to to sfwriter.com, you can sign up for his occasional newsletter, and you can also find him on Patreon, and he's on Facebook and Twitter. As for me, my two newest books are Of Being Woman. It's a collection of feminist science fiction from Noble Fusion Press, and Daughters of Eve, which is a whole nother type of book from Buy It Publishing, which is an essay-based workbook and journaling guide for exploring the nature of our lives today through the lens of the stories of the women of the Hebrew Bible. My website and blog are at sallywienergrada.com, up there, as well as my videos are also there, and they're also on YouTube. You can connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, and sometimes on Blue Sky. Still haven't made that adjustment. And if you want to stay in touch with me and learn about some of the other fascinating folks I'm interviewing, please sign up on my website for my truly very occasional newsletter. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, Rob. This was
You're
wonderful.
so welcome, Sally. See you in Orlando for the International Conference on the Fantastic and the Arts next March. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.